So in our first lesson, we talked about populations and samples, and we got across the idea that what we want to do here is we want to collect some data and we want to use it to draw some conclusions. In this second lesson here, we want to start getting into some of the issues that we have to keep in mind when we are collecting our data. So what we're going to look at today is how does variability affect statistics? And it's rather sort of a vague little goal, but we'll be looking at that throughout the rest of the unit here. And we also want to start thinking about how we can minimize or account for variability when we're collecting our data. So we talked about basically what we were doing. We have some population that we are interested in, and we are taking a sample from that population, and we are measuring some things or getting some data about that sample. Whenever we do this, we are going to counter a thing called sampling error. And sampling error is basically the difference between what we get when we measure something from the sample, so between the measured value and I'll put in brackets here from our sample, and the true value. Now, what do we mean by the true value? Well, the true value is sort of the value that you would get if you went and you measured this thing for every individual in your population. So the true value is what you would get from measuring the entire population. So because you're not measuring absolutely everybody in your population, there's going to be some difference between what your samples tells you and what you would get if you did measure everybody. Okay? So what are some of the things that are going to affect sampling error? Okay? Number one is the size of the population. Okay. Now, it's the first one I'm going to mention here. It's also probably the least important one. The size of the population is only going to affect your sampling error for small populations only. Okay. Once your population is of a certain size, it has no effect on the sampling error. Okay? And making the population bigger above a certain point isn't going to change your sampling error at all. Okay? So, but you can have sampling errors just when you have, let's say, small population only. Let's say no effect for large. A bigger effect on your sampling error is the size of the sample. Whenever you're taking a sample, it's up to you to decide how many individuals you want to choose. Usually what happens is that a smaller sample is more variable than a large sample. So in other words, if we choose a small sample, it's more likely to deviate from what we would get if we were measuring the entire population. So we'll have a larger sampling error, usually. So one of the big questions in statistics is how big should your sample be? How many people is enough to survey so that your answers are, they're never going to be perfect, but you want them to be good enough. Okay? And finally, often the thing that you're trying to measure is inherently variable. Okay? The inherent variability of the thing being measured. So if what you're trying to determine is sort of the height of your population, people are different heights. You expect people to have different heights. So anytime you choose a few people in your sample and you measure their heights, you know that their height is going to vary amongst the sample and between the sample and the population. This is something that you can't eliminate, but you can measure it and get a handle on it. And when we're talking about measuring things like this, we are usually talking about measures of spread in our population or in our data. Okay? So these all affect sampling error. Our goal is often to minimize our sampling error. So it can be minimized by choosing our sample effectively. Basically, we want to make sure that our sample is large enough. Okay, how large is large enough? Well, nobody knows for sure. Okay, so it varies from sample to sample. Okay, and the big thing for us is we want to be able to choose a sample that matches the population as much as possible. So when we say that, we usually want to say that our sample should be representative of the entire population. Now, sampling error, you're never going to eliminate it entirely, but you can measure it, and you can account for it, and you can be honest about it. You can say, there are ways of saying specifically what you think that your sample error is, and that sort of puts, allows you to put the results that you get, or your information into context. Okay? So let's just finish off here by revisiting the example that we looked at in the previous lesson here. Is the sample in this example well chosen? So this is our good friends Mina and Cindy here. Mina wants to know which band Ontario high school students think is the best. Mina's friend Sydney goes to a different school. Cindy, so they go to a different school. So they each survey students at their own school. Is the sample in this example well chosen? Well, they don't tell us how many people they sample, so we don't know whether the sample is large enough. Okay. Okay. We're going to have to say that we don't know. But I think we can say something about whether or not our sample is representative. What do you think? Is this representative of our entire population? There are an awful lot of high schools. We are only surveying 2 of them. And what else is important about these 2 high schools that we're surveying? They're friends. They probably live close together, so their schools are probably close together. So they're basically surveying people in the same geographic location, probably the same socioeconomic background, and then they're trying to apply these results to a very, very diverse population that you have all across the province. So this sample, let's say it's not likely representative. And why not? All of these things that we've said, let's see. Geographically limited. I said, Kale said that these 2 were friends, so they probably have, so he related that to the fact that it's geographically limited. I'm going to say similar backgrounds. What else can we say here? I said something about we're surveying sort of people of the same socio-economic status. Okay, which is sort of a catch-all term here. Okay. So this probably isn't a great sample that is representative of their population as a whole. Now, they could say one way to fix this would be by doing a much bigger sample, sampling people from all across the province. Cindy and Mina probably aren't going to be able to do that. The other thing they could do, though, is they could change the population that they're studying. They could say that they want to know which band high school students in their city think is the best. So by sampling 2 high schools, depending on the city, that might be sufficiently representative that they could study that population instead.